Now, as far as the tax bill is concerned, the last time Congress modernized the tax code, it was 1986. That's more than 30 years, quite obvious to anybody who can subtract. In the generation since, the tax code has grown out of control. It's been a dream come true for who? The professionals in accounting and the lobbyists that protect the loopholes. But it happens to be a real nightmare for most Americans. And I would say for most members of Congress, as you read regularly, very few members of Congress do their own taxes. The outdated tax code helps the powerful and the well-connected, but hurts American workers. It hurts American industry, and it hurts Americans' ability to compete with the rest of the world, and that means lower wages and less employment. The bill passed out of the Finance Committee moves us very much in the right direction to make our tax code simpler, fairer, and more competitive. At the heart of the legislation is a middle-class tax cut. A typical family of four with 2 children making $59,000 a year could see a tax cut of more than $1,700. Very significant tax relief. But you would never know it by listening to the rhetoric of my colleagues of the other political party. They have repeatedly recited the tired lines that Republicans are only interested in giving tax cuts to the wealthy. In fact, they began pushing that narrative even before this bill was written, going way back to September, started analyzing a bill that didn't even exist. It was a charge made by a document that was put out called the Big Six Framework. And framework is no piece of legislation. It merely provided guidelines for tax writing committees to start from. The Partisan Tax Policy Center then filled the gaps with policy assumptions and crafted an analysis to fit their narrative, their analysis of a piece of legislation that hadn't even been written. The problem is their narrative hasn't changed, but the Finance Committee provided policy details that they should have used to change their narrative, but they still keep with the same old rhetoric. I think even the Tax Policy Center would have to agree that the Finance Committee product differs drastically from the underlying assumptions of their initial analysis. So I'm going to try to compare what a tax center policy says about tax law that we ought to pass compared to our bill. And you'll see there seems to be a real closeness of some of the ideas that ought to be done that we get from the left that are in this bill, but they don't even recognize it. The Finance Committee used all the available tools granted under the unified framework to target more relief to middle-income taxpayers and retain the progressivity of the income tax. Let's take a look at some of the major features of the finance bill and how they provide relief for the nation's middle class and low-income earners. First, it nearly doubles the standard deduction, which means that many lower-income Americans will be removed from the tax rolls completely, and tax filing season will be simpler for millions more. Second, it doubles the child tax credit from $1,000 to $2,000 and moderately increases its refundability. Both of these are made possible in a large part by repealing personal exemptions. Personal exemptions for taxpayers and spouses help increase the standard deduction, and the personal exemptions for children helped with increasing the child tax credit. Interestingly enough, these provisions mirror a proposal put out by the left-wing Tax Policy Center in December just last year. Nearly identical to the finance bill, the very liberal Tax Policy Center paper argued for repealing personal exemptions, nearly doubling the standard deduction, and increasing the child tax credit to $2,012. According to the authors of the Liberal Tax Policy Center proposal, such a proposal change would, quote, reduce complexity, remove inequities, and mitigate marriage penalties. That's exactly what the bill before the Senate does. But they don't seem to recognize that, but they sure wanted that as a goal last year. The fact is, these changes provide more tax relief to the middle class and at the same time simplify the tax code. As the Liberal Tax Policy Center paper points out, the value of the personal exemption is largely dependent on the tax bracket of the taxpayer. The higher the tax bracket, the more benefit that comes from the personal exemption. In comparison, the child tax credit generally lowers a taxpayer's tax liability dollar for dollar, regardless of the tax bracket. As a result, repealing personal exemption in favor of expanding the child tax credit makes the tax code more progressive and targets more relief to lower and middle income taxpayers. Admittedly, there are some differences between what was suggested by the Liberal Tax Policy Center and what is in the bill before us. Its proposal would have been more generous on the refundable feature of the child tax credit. But on the opposite end, they would have made the child tax credit available to everyone, even including millionaires. The finance bill is less generous to the affluent because it phases out the credit for married taxpayers with incomes over $500,000. You would think the other side, meaning the Democratic Party, finding fault with this bill, would offer some credit for taking this rather progressive approach to providing family tax relief. But no, they continue repeating their line over and over that this bill is a tax cut for the wealthy. Another major feature of the finance bill that provides relief to middle class and lower income earners is the reduction of the tax rates for middle bracket taxpayers. First, it retains the 10% bracket, which many on the other side express concern about being repeated based on the Big Six framework. So they were wrong in using the framework, but they haven't admitted that. Next, it lowers the current law 15% bracket to 12% and expands its applicability. Additionally, it reduces what is essentially the current law bracket of 25 down to 22, and what is essentially today's current law 28% bracket to a much wider 24% bracket. These rate reductions target tax relief to the very heart of Americans' middle class. Now, you may be wondering how this middle class tax relief bill will be financed, largely by repealing the state and local tax deduction, also known as SALT deduction. Our colleagues on the other side have tried to argue the repeal of the state and local tax deduction as a tax increase on middle class. Nothing further could be from the truth, considering the reduced tax brackets I just discussed in combination with the higher standard deduction and the double child tax credit. The repeal of the state and local tax deduction is actually a very key piece of this legislation that makes the middle class tax cuts possible. The state and local tax deduction overwhelmingly benefits the so-called wealthy that our colleagues on the other side vehemently argue should receive no tax benefits under this bill. And I'm going to tell you now how the liberal elements in this town see the state and local tax deduction as something that should have gone away anyway, and now they're complaining because we're doing away with it. So I don't want you to take my word. Here are several partisan think tanks have said about the state and local tax deduction in the past. According to the Tax Policy Center, and remember that's that left-wing organization finding fault with a bill even before it was written, about 40% of the state and local tax deduction benefits go to taxpayers with incomes exceeding $500,000. So we do away with the state and local tax deduction because it benefits wealthy people and they don't give us any credit for it. Keep in mind that tax filers with incomes of $500,000 or more only make up about 1% of all tax filers, making it a very lopsided benefit. Here's what the very left-wing Center for American Progress has said about the state and local tax deduction. Quote, the deduction for state and local taxes disproportionately benefits high-income taxpayers, property owners, and residents of high-tax states. That's because these groups pay the most taxes at the state and local level. It also benefits high-income taxpayers because any kind of deduction is worth more to people in the high tax brackets than the low tax brackets. Now, I just got done quoting the Center for American Progress that said the state and local tax deduction ought to be done away with because it benefits wealthy people. And yet they complain to us that our tax bill is a tax benefit for the wealthy. To further illustrate how who eliminating the state and local tax benefit really hits, I'd like to highlight a recent Bloomberg article titled, quote, Tax hike fears trigger talk of exodus from Manhattan and Greenwich. Now, this article is about concerns from middle class, is not about concerns from middle class police officers or teachers on repeal of the state and local tax deduction. Instead, it highlights concerns from wealthy hedge fund managers who may now consider moving out of the high tax state of New York. So here's the Bloomberg article, quote, the problem for Connecticut hedge fund set, and more broadly for a lot of Wall Street crowd, is that Republican proposals in both the House and Senate would drive up taxes for many high earners in the New York City area by eliminating the deduction for most state and local taxes. An individual making a yearly salary of $1 million would owe the Internal Revenue Service an additional $21,000, end of quote. So we, in this legislation, repeal that deduction and make these people, this person making a yearly salary of $1 million pay $21,000 more taxes, and it's and liberal groups are proposing doing away with it, and we put it in our bill so that we don't let these wealthy people get the benefit of the tax deduction, and they don't recognize it. So I ask my colleagues on the left, are you prepared to go to bat over SALT deductions for millionaire hedge fund managers? From listening to my Democratic colleagues' rhetoric, I am really surprised by this article. I thought Republicans were all about tax cuts for the wealthy and giveaways to Wall Street. But this article suggests otherwise. In fact, these types of taxpayers are likely to experience sizable tax hikes under the proposal on the Senate floor now. According to the Nonpartisan Joint Committee on Taxation, by 2023, nearly 30% of taxpayers with incomes exceeding $1 million will experience a tax hike. That does not sound like a giveaway to the wealthy to me.